All right. Yo, what's up? Let's make a video talking about the easiest and hardest dungeons to be able to complete on this week's reset. Now, this is a site called realmeta.com, and they have a basically data analytics driven site that takes all of the aggregate data from Raider.io and puts it in a tier list and kind of shows you what the easiest key is to time at between the levels of 8 and 11. It's 8 and 11 right now. I suspect it might change in the future, but it's 8 and 11 right now, and I think that now is a great time to talk about what the easiest and hardest dungeons are to time and why they're so easy or so hard a lot of the times. Additionally, I think that there's going to be just some general advice as to how to kind of progress and proceed through the dungeons and like what you guys are struggling with, because I think that it's pretty easy to tell what the hardest parts of this dungeon are in each and every single dungeon and like what you could potentially be facing as a pitfall in these dungeons. So first off, the S tier dungeon is Arara. I think it's pretty easy to see why Arara is the easiest dungeon. Not a lot of stuff is deadly in there. I do think the first boss can present a little bit of a challenge if you don't have battle reses or if somebody gets hit by the ground effect on the Gossamer Burst. In general, though, like the timer in that place is a little bit more lenient than other dungeons, which allows you a lot more wiggle room to, have wipes or mistakes or whatever else, which is fine. Beyond that, the only other way you actually really wipe to this dungeon is you wipe to the last boss. Now, it is a little bit more challenging to be able to dodge the waves and dodge the webbing sometimes, but assuming that people understand fully how the mechanics work, Arara is definitely one of the easiest keys of the season, and like having played it a few times, I definitely see how people are having a lot of success in it. Next up, it's between Wake Mists and Dawnbreaker. I think that Mists is probably the second easiest key. A lot of it comes down to the fact that more often than not, people have a lot more experience in Mists of Tyranid Scythe. The hardest parts of Mists, in my opinion, first off, the first boss. So how you can help yourself with that first boss, you can save Lust for it, and that makes that a lot easier. The other pretty challenging part of Mists sometimes, and this is at like a very high level, is actually the timer. But like whenever you're trying to do a 10, whenever you're trying to do a 9 or whatever, the timer's not really something that you're factoring in. Because you have more damage than you're going to be able to face against the timer. And so Mists isn't necessarily hard in that regard for a lot of other players. And so that's why I think it's actually like the second easiest dungeon. There are a decent amount of spots where your tank can die. You can actually accrue a lot of deaths to the first pull. But in general, I think it's rather challenging to die to Mists and Arara compared to the rest of the dungeons. And that's one of the big things that you have to know with like all these dungeons that you're seeing this season, is that I think the reason that some of these are the hardest is because these are the easiest to die in. I've had, 30, 40 death endeavors in a couple of these dungeons where the 15-second death penalties were actually the thing that chalked my key. I had like a 20 death Baral at some point, and the 5 minutes or whatever of death penalty that we had, that was actually what depleted the key. It's not that we missed the timer per se. It was just the additional 15 seconds per death that chalked the key. And so, and I think that Baral, Stone Vault, Grim Battle, and City of Threads, we're going to talk about this in a second, but I think that that's what makes those different than dungeons like Arara and Mists of Tyranid Scythe. Necrotic Wake. Necrotic Wake's timer is fairly lenient. The issue with Necrotic Wake right now, I think it's the fact that you have to get a lot of count. A lot of people miscount in that dungeon. They adjusted count from the beta until now to the point where you actually end up having to get a ton of count. And so, I mean, if we go to 3chest.io, you basically have to pull like everything in here to just get counted. It's actually insane just how much stuff you actually have to be able to grab. But in general, more often than not, if people are depleting Necrotic Wake, it's because you wiped to a Marth, or you wiped to Surgeon Stitchflesh, or you wiped an Althor. But probably to a Marth and Surgeon Stitchflesh. I would recommend watching the video that I released yesterday talking about how to make sure that you're killing a Marth and Surgeon Stitchflesh if you're looking for advice specifically tailored towards those. I think that Mist is definitely easier than Necrotic Wake. I actually think that Dawnbreaker is easier than Necrotic Wake, even though they have Necrotic Wake is a little bit easier. In general, Dawnbreaker was like one of the hardest keys on the beta because everything did so much damage. But because everything did so much damage on the beta, Blizzard tuned down a lot of that stuff. And whenever Blizzard tuned down a lot of that stuff, a lot of the mobs no longer really do that much damage. They're not really that threatening. You're not getting one shot by the orb. You're not doing a 12 where you're actually at danger of dying to like heal checks and whatnot. The last boss's debuff isn't killing you, that kind of thing. And so or healers are at least able to out heal it. So that's one of the reasons that Dawnbreaker is easy. I think that Dawnbreaker is hard for a couple of different reasons. Dawnbreaker is hard because more often than not, I think players don't know where to go the first time. I don't think it's a very intuitive dungeon just in general. but I think that's more of like a design space issue than like a player issue. And I think that Dawnbreaker is one of those dungeons that like once you do it one time, even on M0, you kind of know what's up and you kind of know how to play. Now, keeping yourself alive is another thing, and but like I was able to time a Dawnbreaker with like 10 deaths this week, and I think Dawnbreaker 10 with 10 deaths this week, and I think it's something that it's pretty easy. And so basically, if you want general advice, if you're looking for keys to get your weekly done on, Dawnbreaker, Mystic Scythe, and Arara are probably the ones that I would recommend. I think that Necrotic Wake is probably passable, but I would be less so inclined to try Necrotic Wake as hard. Let's talk about the dungeon you want to stay away from. Siege of Baralis. I think that Siege of Baralis is okay-ish, but you really need to skip a lot of the beginning trash. I was watching Kalamazoo earlier in this dungeon, and this guy was mad bitching about the first area of Siege of Baralis, and he depleted the absolute hell out of that key. Now, this is no flame of Kalamazoo, not his fault. The beginning trash, particularly like the Enforcers and the Iron-Tired Raiders and the Black Tar Bombers, are just bullshit. Like, let's be straight up. Those mobs are just dumb as hell. And so if you're actually going to go in that place, I would definitely try to go in with a plan, try to skip as many mobs in the beginning as possible, and then Siege of Baralis actually becomes a lot more fair, because the timer, not too bad in there. There is a really weird overlap on the last boss that you need to know about. The second Tentacle Slam of the fight corresponds with debuff coming out, where you get the Breakwater Circle Dispel thing on you. And that could one-shot you 100-0 if you're not careful, or if you don't press large enough defensive. You just need to know about that in advance, and that way, you know that you need to press the large defensive. But I think that Baralis can be okay, especially if you're able to get through the first area. But it's not especially easy. Next up, we have Stone Vault. And I think that Stone Vault, Grim Batol, and City of Threads are all in about the same tier, but I understand why some people would feel a little bit differently. Stone Vault is difficult because I think the coordination check in this dungeon is really easy to mess up, and unlike Siege of Baralis, it's not one part of the dungeon that's difficult, it's almost the entire dungeon, and it's a lot of the bosses. I think that something that these bottom three dungeons have in common is that the bosses can wipe you. Where Necrotic Wake in the top 5, Necrotic Wake was the only one that the bosses realistically could wipe you. Stone Vault, Grim Batol, and City of Threads all have a couple or one boss that can wipe you a lot. Stone Vault, it's Master Machinists. Master Machinists have a mechanic where the box is exploding at the same time the vents are going off, and if you aren't aware and you're not repositioning fast enough and you're not pressing Zephyr and Magic Zone and a lot of defensives, you're probably just going to die. Additionally, I think that this is the reason that I like playing with the Preservation Evoker or Resto Shaman this week, because they can heal the absolute hell out of your group. Now, it's not always the most important thing to play meta, but I think at least I know what I'm kind of getting whenever I'm inviting a Resto Shaman or a Preservation Evoker. But in general, the issues with Stone Vault are the fact that, you can die to a lot of random stuff. It's really easy to die to the frontal from the big machinists, and the loaders, I think, are the actual name of the mob. Whenever they shoot that gun, it's like really easy to have a lapse in judgment for a couple seconds and get hit by the big orb that's coming at you. And so then that costs you 15 seconds, and the run back is not especially nice or forgiving. And then, God forbid, if you ever have a death on Master Machinist, it's kind of over. And then it's not that Skarmorax is particularly easy, and I think that people run into this issue all the time where they actually just don't know what the fuck is going on Skarmorax. Basically, how it works is that you actually need to kill one of the crystals at a time, and let the debuff fall off, but you really need to be prioing killing the crystals. You're going to be able to have some boss damage over time, but it's not like you're supposed to be hitting the boss more often than not. The biggest issue by far that I see on that boss is that most of your DPS players don't know what the fuck they're doing with the buff. People aren't getting off the boss, people aren't picking up the buff, people aren't extending the buff properly. So if you don't know, you can pick up one of the buffs that drops off the first Skarmorax debuff drop, and you pick it up a little bit late, and then you pick up one of the buffs from the second set rather early, and you can extend that buff. And in general, you want like 3 stacks, maybe even 2 to 3 stacks on your healer and all of your DPS, realistically, and your tank doesn't pick up any. If you're playing on Augvoker, you also don't want any, but that's neither here nor there. But that actually makes that fight so much easier, but so many people mess it up. And so, that's why Stone Vault's not that great. I think that there's a lot of opportunities to actually wipe in that dungeon. Grim Batol, I think a lot of the difficulty of Grim Batol comes from, actually, funnily enough, the trash. The trash in the first area is pretty brutal. The dragons are tough. You have the overseers that enrage the pack that are pretty tough. You also have the, oh gosh, what are they called? I don't call them enforcers. the mobs that enrage towards the latter half of the dungeon. What are these called? Oh yeah. Oh wait, no, this is not the pursuer. These mobs, the lava benders. These are fucking brutal for God knows what reason, and they end up wiping you. I mean, I've seen a lot of trash deaths, even like the molten giant and the beguilers, because kicks and pugs, you never really know what you're gonna get, and it's kind of like a gamble. Additionally, this last boss and these corruptors are bullshit. I suspect that these are gonna get nerfed, but these are bullshit. Straight up, I would recommend skipping this 2-pack if you can get the count somewhere else, but I don't think you really can. This last boss is bullshit because unless your group is like super coordinated, anybody who gets caught in a tentacle just dies. Anybody who's not pre-spread fast enough just wipes your group or potentially dies. And if you kill the ads at the wrong time, you can just die to the heal check. So that's brutal. I think that, I in general think that Grim Patrol is easier than Stone Vault, but it's not by a ton. It also doesn't help that these Warlock mobs are basically bring a Dispel or die. You got to bring a Resto Shaman or Mage. Both. Something like that. But yeah, Grim Patrol, not the easiest key. But I do kind of think that it's a little bit easier than Stone Vault, but I would still avoid it in terms of like weekly key doing. Last dungeon, City of Threats. I think that City of Threats is my personal hardest dungeon to be able to time. I think that the last boss and the first boss in this dungeon are coordination checks that pugs are obviously going to struggle mightily with. Just the knowledge of how to move the first boss around the room isn't something that like you're really going to expect with a pug tank. And if you're not moving it properly, if you're not getting the dispel off at the right time, there's like a bunch of bullshit going on. It's really easy to wipe to that guy. And it doesn't help that Ezo, the Grand Splicer, is absolutely overtuned with the Splicer Dot. Now, the Splicer Dot did end up getting nerfed recently, but it's not something that is particularly easy. The movement on this fight is brutal. Nobody in the history of a pug ever has wanted to group up, and while this is something that's fine on the last boss of Misted Tyrannus Scythe, it's pretty unacceptable on the last boss of City of Threats. And so I think it's pretty clear as to how people are depleting this key. It's just like the first and the final boss are wiping people, thus the timer's not exactly free to begin with, and so then it ends up getting depleted. Wowhead had this tier list where they ended up ranking, Necrotic Quake in D tier, City of Threads in D tier, Borealis in C, Stone Vault in C. I kind of tend to agree with that. They had Grim Patrol in B. This feels about right in terms of vibes. I actually think that Necrotic Wake is maybe a little bit easier than like Stone Vault and stuff like that. I think that Necrotic Wake runs into this issue where it's more just like how players are doing that dungeon. Yeah, but in general, if you're looking for dungeons for weekly keys, stick to Arara, stick to Mist, stick to Dawnbreaker. Necrotic Wake is, it's playable. I don't think it's like easy, but I think it's like playable, especially since people have been there before. So there's like a familiarity thing that it helps compared to Stone Vault, right? Because people haven't been in Stone Vault. Borealis, first area Borealis is just nuclear. If you can get through that, then you can get through the dungeon. Rest of the dungeons, stay away. Anyhow, that's it for me today. I hope to see you guys in next week's video. Or tomorrow's video. Not next week's video. Tomorrow's video. I actually don't know what I'm going to make a video about tomorrow. Leave a comment if you have any ideas of what you want to see a video on. Because I am out of content. Goodbye.